Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Pew Charitable Trusts for this webinar entitled, Are Sin Taxes Healthy for State Budgets? My name is Emily Maher, and I am a research analyst in the Fiscal Affairs Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'll be serving as a moderator of today's webinar. As a reminder, if at any time during the webinar you have any difficulty hearing the audio through your computer speakers, please use your telephone to dial in for the audio portion. Next slide, please. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trust to bring this webinar to you. In case you are not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staff of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths and territories. NCSL provides a number of different services, including research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. Next slide. Sin taxes fall primarily within the jurisdiction of NCSL's Standing Committee on Budgets and Revenue. NCSL's standing committees provide a forum for legislators and legislative staff to exchange ideas and shape public policy. They meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit, which is coming up in a week and a half in Los Angeles, and at the NCSL Capitol Forum, which will take place in early December in Washington, D.C. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. This jointly sponsored webinar will look at state reliance on specific, narrowly focused taxes and discuss possible strategies to manage these revenue streams. We'll hear from experts from the Pew Charitable Trusts and the state of Colorado as they discuss recent trends and the implications of these taxes. After we hear from our presenters, we will open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you can simply type a question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. Your question will not be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We will take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. Now we'll turn the program over to Mary Murphy at the Pew Charitable Trust. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks very much, Emily, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mary Murphy, and I'm a director with the State's Fiscal Health Project at the Pew Charitable Trust. To share just some brief background about Pew and our project team, Pew is a nonprofit independent public policy organization, and the State's Fiscal Health Project researches fiscal and economic conditions and practices across the country. Our specific areas of focus include rainy day funds, revenue volatility, and associated Sorry about that, brief audio challenge, hopefully now resolved. The State Fiscal Health Project researches fiscal and economic conditions and practices across the country, and our specific areas of focus include rainy day funds, revenue volatility and associated challenges, economic development tax incentives, and debt management policies, just to name a few examples. So today, I'm pleased to discuss the findings of a new report, Are Sin Taxes Healthy for State Budgets? This is a joint project between Pew and the Rockefeller Institute of Government, and we're examining taxes on alcohol, tobacco, and gambling, including how revenue from these sources performed over recent years. The report also looks at the emerging markets of marijuana and e-cigarettes and state taxation approaches to both. This is, of course, a particularly timely topic with the Supreme Court recently legalizing sports betting nationwide. Many states are expected to consider implementing and taxing the activity. Also in recent years, expanded gambling laws have led several states to open a slate of new casinos, and marijuana also continues to be a popular topic in the states. But with all this attention to these types of taxes, policymakers need a clear understanding of their potential budget impacts. This new research finds that so-called sin taxes can provide short-term revenue boosts. However, because of a combination of factors, they may drive budget challenges in the long term, and when relied on for ongoing commitments, they can risk creating structural budget imbalances. In addition to sharing the findings of this newly released research, we'll also be hearing from Larson Silva, Principal Economist with Colorado's Legislative Council staff. Larson will be sharing details of Colorado's experience forecasting and budgeting marijuana revenue. And finally, we'll also briefly cover findings from another recent Pew report, State Strategies for Maintaining a Balanced Budget. This research, which we just released in June, examines how states can manage non-recurring revenue, including volatile sources, one-time receipts, and temporary tax increases. Findings from this research are relevant to policymaker considerations of some sin tax revenues, as well as having broader applications across other revenue types. Both of these papers are currently posted at our website, which is pewtrusts.org/fiscal-health. So first, what are the revenue streams that we're discussing today? Sin taxes are typically a type of excise or special tax, which is a tax on a specific good or activity. They're sometimes called sin taxes because they're levies on activities deemed detrimental or undesirable to the consumer. There are, of course, other types of taxes and fees that are sometimes described as sin taxes, but this research looks specifically at tobacco, alcohol, gambling, and newer state actions tied to e-cigarettes and marijuana. One general feature of sin taxes is that they contain this inherent tension. So on the one hand, they're often meant to deter individuals from engaging in harmful behaviors, while on the other hand, states often hope to collect meaningful revenue from taxing these activities. Of course, if the first objective is successful, states will see declines in both the behavior and correspondingly the revenue collected. These dynamics also mean that a state may collect revenue in one year, but shouldn't necessarily expect to collect the same, much less a growing amount in the next or future budget years. So policymakers should therefore take the long view when budgeting these revenue sources. Before we get into the revenue trends identified in this research, I want to note the tax structure issue, which is important when understanding these revenue dynamics. So in some cases, a tax is levied on the quantity of the product, not its dollar value. So for example, cigarette taxes are applied on a per pack basis. Under this structure, revenues only increase if consumption goes up, for example, if people buy more packs of cigarettes, or if policymakers increase tax rates. Inflation alone, which increases the price of the pack of cigarettes, would not lead to revenue growth. An alternative to taxing quantity sold is to tax the value or price of the product. With this approach, of course, if the value of a product goes up, so does the collected tax. I just want to highlight this tax structure distinction before we get into the details, because it's important to keep in mind as we look at how specific revenues have performed and why. So first, tobacco is a prime example of how sin tax revenue can pose challenges. This figure is showing U.S. smoking rates from 1970 to 2016. This is a longer time horizon than much of the revenue analysis in this paper, but it's helpful to take a longer historical perspective here on how behaviors have shifted. You can see here that smoking rates have fallen precipitously and continuously since their peak in the early 1980s. So perhaps unsurprisingly, when we look at tax revenue collections between 2008 and 2016, we see average tobacco tax revenue across all states fell by 1%. Changes in consumer behavior are clearly a significant underlying factor in revenue performance here, but it's also important to note the tax structure issue again. Because cigarette taxes are based on quantity rather than price, tax collections won't rise with inflation. Revenue growth relies on tax rate or consumption increases. And as the percentage of the population that uses tobacco has shrunk and will likely continue to do so, the importance of tax increases to spur revenue growth has come into sharp relief. So this map shows the relationship between tax policy changes and revenues. In this map, the blue states are the ones that raised tax rates over the study period, and many of these states also raised rates multiple times. The shaded states are the states that saw tobacco revenues rise over this time. So of the 28 blue states that raised rates, 19 also saw revenues increase. On the flip side, of the 22 states that did not increase tax rates, those gray states, 21, so nearly all of them, saw revenues fall. These numbers illustrate that with a quantity-based tax and declining usage, tax increases are virtually necessary, though still not always sufficient for revenue to go up. Further underscoring this are trends in alcohol, which is also taxed on quantity rather than value. But unlike tobacco, inflation-adjusted alcohol tax revenue nationwide was up 12% in 2016 compared to 2008, and this in spite of only a handful of states raising alcohol tax rates over that period. So this slide shows that just 6 states raised alcohol tax rates over the study period, far fewer than what we just saw on tobacco tax rate hikes. 38 states saw increases in alcohol tax revenue during this time compared to the 20 whose tobacco revenue rose. And in fact, median tax rates for beer, wine, and spirits are actually lower than they were in the 1980s after accounting for inflation. The growth in alcohol tax revenue is due to an increase in consumption, and consumption concentrated in wine and spirits, which are both usually taxed at higher rates than beer. Now, even though this revenue source did grow over the study period, policymakers should still take the long view on alcohol tax revenue. Because revenues are based on consumption and that usage ebbs and flows with societal trends and consumer whims, revenue gains may be inconsistent and difficult to forecast. And as other experts have noted, it's important to bear in mind that increased alcohol use can come with higher social and public health costs, along with the potential revenue gains. Now, moving on to gambling. Gambling presents some different challenges. These activities account for the greatest share of sin tax revenue in the US. In 2015, revenue collections from gambling represented over half of all state sin tax revenue collections. State and local gambling revenue come almost entirely from lotteries, casinos, and racinos, which are casino racetrack hybrids. But growth in these revenues has been inconsistent. So data from our study period show that real growth in lottery revenue, for example, has been close to zero. And while a slew of new casinos and racinos have produced windfalls in some states, they've poached business from their older neighbors, both within states and across state lines. The revenue gains are accompanied by losses from older establishments within the state or between states that expand at different times. Maryland exemplifies this dynamic. So for example, if we look just at 2016 to 2017, the state's casinos brought in increased tax revenue overall. But if we remove MGM National Harbor, which is the newest casino, from the equation, we see that revenue from the 5 older casinos actually fell by 16% over this period. So as tempting as it may be to turn to new casinos as a fresh source of revenue, states should consider that these gains may be short-lived, in large part because of increased competition, and be cautious about directing this revenue towards ongoing expenditures. Instead of looking at just a single state, another way to examine this trend is in the aggregate across states. So this slide illustrates the disparity between early and late adopters of gambling establishments. The y-axis shows cumulative real percentage change in casino and racino revenue. The dark blue line represents all states with operational casinos or racinos, and the light blue line represents only early adopter states. In other words, states that opened their casinos or racinos before 2008. So we can see here that the growth in overall revenue is driven by the late adopters, in this case, Kansas, Maryland, and Ohio. Of course, the discussion of gambling would not be complete without a mention of the recent Supreme Court ruling that overturned the 1992 ban on sports betting. A number of states are now considering it as a new way to boost revenues, but policymakers should bear a few things in mind on this point. And so one is that the potential of this revenue stream is difficult to forecast because, by definition, there's very limited data. And two, if sports betting does behave similarly to other types of gambling, states could experience short-lived gains followed by a downward pressure on revenues as more and more states legalize. And finally, the revenue stream will likely be small. Nevada, the only state offering sports betting before this ruling, brought in about $17 million in 2017, which represents about 0.2% of the state's total revenue. Marijuana is another widely discussed potential new revenue source in the states. Medical marijuana is now legal in 30 states and Washington, D.C., and recreational marijuana is legal in 9 states plus D.C. and is sold at store counters in 6. One interesting thing to note about marijuana is that, in contrast to tobacco and alcohol, states have been experimenting with the structure of these levies, with most of them taxing the goods' value instead of its quantity. Many states have also refined the complexity of tax structures as they've worked through challenges with enforcement and compliance. The revenue intake for states with operational markets has been strong, but also somewhat volatile, as we can see in the figures showing Colorado's tax revenue in millions from both medical and recreational marijuana. Many states have expressed a view that while the added dollars are certainly welcome, the revenue stream is small as a share of total budgets. And then finally, there are hurdles to overcome when forecasting marijuana revenue. Data on the demand for marijuana are still limited, and prices are uncertain at best in a market where demand and supply are still in flux. So to present a deeper dive into these challenges, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Larson Silva, Principal Economist with Colorado's Legislative Council staff, to share some more about Colorado's experience. Larson?
Yeah, thanks. I think that was pretty helpful and teased me up well for what I'm going to talk about in Colorado. I'm a principal economist with the Colorado Legislative Council staff. We're the nonpartisan research staff for the Colorado General Assembly, and I've been working on marijuana forecasts since before it was legalized in 2012 in Colorado, and have sort of kept up with it. So before I talk about the tax structure in Colorado, I'm going to talk about some of the constraints, and that has really informed how we've taxed marijuana in Colorado. So the first thing to know is that in 2012, voters approved Amendment 64, which was a constitutional amendment legalizing the sale and possession of recreational marijuana. Part of that language said that there is a 15% excise tax to be dedicated to school construction. And a second sort of constitutional constraint that we have in the state is TABOR, where any tax increase has to be voter approved. So go to the next slide. So given those constraints, this is the tax structure that we have. We have a 15% excise tax, and the first $40 million of that goes to school construction. We have a special sales tax of 15%, and that goes to pay for some of the social costs of marijuana legalization. And then the state sales tax applies to medical marijuana. Now, part of the reason why it's important to keep in mind those constraints is that when we went to voters, before we could institute the 15% special sales tax or the 15% excise tax, we had to go to voters. And the General Assembly said, well, what will they approve? What will they say is a reasonable tax structure, tax rate, etc.? And so the excise tax in the amendment that legalized marijuana said there should be an excise tax equal to 15%. Well, most of the time, excise taxes are on the unit or a per unit consumption, sort of think about the cigarette tax. But our Constitution, after voters approved Amendment 64, said it's the excise tax equal to 15%. In addition, that was dedicated to school construction, and the General Assembly, when they were going through the process of figuring out how to tax marijuana, said, well, there's going to be other social costs, and we should try to pay for those social costs with another tax. So we're going to have a special sales tax, and both of those had to be voter approved. So with that, they had to tell voters exactly how the money was going to be spent. I'll talk about the budgeting process a little bit, but I want to talk about the revenue trends on the next slide, please. So this is a graph of marijuana sales in the state, recreational marijuana sales, and as was mentioned before, it's growing pretty quickly. So we have 52 months of data so far since marijuana was first sold on January 1st, 2014, and the monthly average growth rate has been 3.7%, or the compound monthly growth rate is 3.7%. So that's an annual growth rate of 44.7%, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, that's the most growth we've had in any one of our revenue sources in the state. And it started really low. So one thing for other states as they're looking at marijuana revenues would be to build in some time for the revenue to come in. So these are brand new businesses. They've never paid taxes before. There's going to be local zoning requirements or regulation requirements before those stores can actually open and start selling marijuana products. And then there's going to be a period of transition between the gray market or the black market to retail marijuana stores. So with all of that in mind, we have seen strong growth. I'm forecasting it to slow down sort of as the market matures and consumer behavior is sort of settles in, and as opposed to having a brand new industry where you would expect more growth, it's maturing. So that's kind of how we've dealt with it in Colorado, and just for other states, just to think about, there's going to be some time for implementation costs to kick in. Next slide, please. So in terms of revenue in the state, we collected $211 million in fiscal year 16-17 total on marijuana. So that's $98.3 million from the special sales tax, $71.9 million from the marijuana excise tax, and $40.9 million on the 2.9% general sales tax on marijuana. So $211 million is definitely money that is used in the state budget, but it's 1.5% of total tax revenue for the state of Colorado. So while it's definitely a bonus, and that's nice money to be able to work with for the General Assembly, it's not enough to pay for full day kindergarten or pre-K or rebuild the state's roads and infrastructure, some of the other big pressures that are on state budgets. So I wanted to show that slide and sort of put it in context that it's still driven by individual income taxes and sales taxes and gas taxes, that sort of stuff, where there's just more revenue involved. Next slide, please. So this revenue is spent a couple different ways. So some of the excise tax revenue is constitutionally dedicated to school construction. And so that's being used for immediate sort of health and safety concerns. So new roofs on schools, abating lead pipes, asbestos, repairing and replacing heating and air conditioning. So there's a grant program in the state so that school districts can say, well, we don't have the resources to do this on our own, but we need to do it. It's a health and safety issue. So we're going to apply for a grant, and some of the marijuana money goes to that. The special sales tax, the 15% special sales tax, is the main source of revenue for the marijuana tax cash fund. And that's a special fund that was set up when voters approved those two taxes that I was talking about, when voters approved the tax. And basically when voters approved it, it said, we're going to collect this revenue and we're going to use that revenue to pay for the social costs of marijuana legalization. And so each year, the General Assembly budgets marijuana tax revenue for alcohol and drug abuse prevention, try to reduce recidivism in jails, public health and environment, so running education campaigns and trying to study the health impacts. There's a big component that goes to our Department of Education, and so that's to do nurse schools, or get more nurses in schools or more counselors in schools to help interact with kids and try to keep them from using marijuana. And there's a good chunk of money that goes to the Department of Local Affairs, and that goes to police departments in general who are working with trying to identify stoned drivers or trying to look at and regulate the local marijuana industries and make sure that they are legal rather than illegal operations. And then a lot of money goes to other different agencies across the state that are all involved with marijuana regulation somehow. So the Department of Agriculture, marijuana is a crop, and so they need to figure out what pesticides can be used. So most of the time they'd go to the feds and say, well, whatever the FDA says you can use, say on tobacco, you could use it on, is safe to use on marijuana. But the federal FDA doesn't look at pesticides and how they're used on marijuana and whether that causes any health and safety impacts. So that falls to the Department of Agriculture here. So there's a lot of more limited programs within those other departments that aren't necessarily identified here. Another thing that's kind of unique about how marijuana revenue is spent in Colorado is it's spent the year after it's collected. So when I presented the forecast in 2014 for the General Assembly and said, I don't know how much revenue is going to come in. It's a brand new industry. We had 1 month of data, and it's illegal at the federal level. So we didn't know if the Department of Justice was going to have an injunction and have no more and prevent any marijuana sales. The General Assembly didn't want to budget revenue in the year that we receive it and have to potentially rescind it from the agencies or the programs. So they set up the marijuana tax cash fund where money is collected, deposited into the marijuana tax cash fund, and then is appropriated in the following year. And so that adds some budget stability for a brand new revenue source. In addition, those are in general one-time programs. So they're not necessarily an ongoing expenditure that is built from last year's budget. It's more of a one-time impact where if you can afford more revenue for drug prevention and treatment, then you can do that through the marijuana tax cash fund, but it's not necessarily a guarantee that next year's appropriation is going to be the same amount that it was from the previous year. So going to the next slide is talking a little bit about sort of the whether it's a unit or a value of the marijuana sold, and we have constitutional language saying it's a 15% excise tax. So the General Assembly took that to mean that they want to treat all units of marijuana the same. So if you have an ounce of marijuana flower, it doesn't matter whether it's a costly strand of marijuana or really cheap, all of that is going to be based on the same price. And then the excise tax is going to be 15% of that calculated wholesale average market rate for that type of product. So it's sort of a way of trying to acknowledge that in the Constitution it says a 15% excise tax, even though there was a lot of questions about what that meant. As part of that, you have the Department of Revenue calculates the average wholesale rate, and that's the basis for the excise tax. One thing that's happened over time is that the calculated average wholesale rate has fallen, which would be consistent with a new market where you have more mechanization and more. It's just more efficient to produce an ounce of marijuana in the first quarter of 2018 than it was in the first quarter of 2015. So you have high fixed costs, but marijuana plants are growing and people are getting better at harvesting that and getting it onto the market. And so you have this slow downward trend in the calculated average wholesale market rate. So even if you have more consumption of marijuana at the wholesale level or more sold to the retailer and a falling price, you may not have more revenue. So it's definitely one of the things in the Pew slides that I was looking at and thought that this would be worth bringing up, and just sort of that idea that we've had a lot of growth, but at the same time, prices are coming down as the market matures and people are more efficient in producing marijuana. So that wraps up my slides on Colorado's experience with marijuana taxation and revenue.
Thank you so much, Larson. That's terrific detail about Colorado's experience. I'm also guessing you'll have a lot of questions from the audience about other aspects of Colorado's experience in just a minute. But I now want to just briefly summarize the findings of another research report that Pew just released in June, titled State Strategies for Maintaining a Balanced Budget. This report is not specific to sin tax revenue, but looks broadly at non-recurring revenues, so what they are, why identifying these revenue sources is important, and strategies states can employ to build stable budgets over time. So for this report, we looked at practices across the 50 states to examine if and how states have formalized process to identify non-recurring or one-time revenue, and whether they have codified policies for budgeting these sources. Our report features case studies highlighting state practices for both identifying and managing non-recurring revenues. And this is an important issue for state policymakers because, of course, the continued over-reliance on non-recurring revenue during expansion periods can lead to a structural deficit where recurring costs continually outpace recurring revenue. The longer a structural deficit persists, the harder it is to come back from. And when the non-recurring revenue runs out, states might then short their pension contributions or take on more debt. And these situations can lead to credit downgrades and drive other persistent challenges. These broader budgeting challenges are relevant to our conversation about sin taxes because even though lawmakers can expect to collect revenue from tobacco, alcohol, and gambling every year, unlike, say, an obviously one-time event like a big legal settlement, revenue performance may be characterized by volatility with dramatic spikes and drops, steady decline, or simply unknown performance, as in the case with these new markets. So I won't discuss this research in depth on this webinar, but I do want to briefly share the recommendations from this research report before we move into the Q&A. So the first recommendation is that states have a clear understanding of how well the recurring revenue can cover expected costs both now and in the future, and that they clearly define and separate out recurring and non-recurring revenues in the budget. Further, states should extend out their projections of recurring revenue to determine how far they can cover these costs over multiple years. So a budget may be balanced this year, but long-term projections can provide a warning sign that state policies may be unsustainable. One example of this is that every other year, Maine's Bureau of the Budget produces what they have coined the structural gap report. This is an extension of the forecast of revenues and spending under current law and trends to show the long-term balance between recurring revenue and costs. While not all states may choose to tie their current budget decisions to future projections, it's still good to understand how current budget decisions affect the future. The long-term budget can be used to predict budget deficits and help lawmakers consider the future impact of current budget choices. A second recommendation of this report, and one that's especially relevant for the syntax discussion, is for states to expand their definition of non-recurring revenue beyond obvious items like reserves or legal settlements. Even annually collected revenue sources can exhibit one-time spikes, and in fact, evidence shows these spikes are becoming more common as revenues increase in volatility. Treating these spikes like normal revenue and allocating them toward ongoing costs during good economic times will exacerbate budget problems during downturns, requiring more budget cuts or tax increases. So states should consider separating out some of their annually collected revenue sources into recurring and non-recurring parts. And then the final recommendation from this research calls on states to develop guidance to ensure that non-recurring revenue is used on one-time spending. Although there is general acceptance that non-recurring revenue should be dedicated to one-time spending, the challenge then becomes, what does one-time spending mean? Some spending is required by law, while legislatures approve other spending annually. Many of these appropriations may not be guaranteed in future budgets, though few would argue that all those spending items are truly one-time. For example, money allocated to state employee salaries is unlikely to be a non-recurring cost. Because of this ambiguity, some states have placed guidance in law for how to spend non-recurring money. So one example is Louisiana defines appropriate uses for non-recurring revenue in its constitution. The legislature can allocate these funds only to pay off bonds, reduce the state's public retirement system debt, fund capital projects, and make deposits into the state's rainy day fund and wetlands conservation fund. The important thing here is that states have clear guidance for how non-recurring revenue is treated differently than recurring revenue. So in concluding the presentation, I want to just quickly summarize the syntax findings and emphasize why these topics are so important. So this new research examines revenue generated by a diverse set of activities. And although revenue collections from alcohol, tobacco, and gambling did vary over the study period, the primary takeaway here is that policymakers should exercise caution when relying on these revenue sources to plug budget gaps. These levies can provide state coffers with necessary resources, and that's especially important in the current environment of limited fiscal flexibility for many states. But as policymakers seek to achieve structurally balanced budgets and ensure that the resources necessary to meet state spending commitments are available year after year, carefully analyzing performance of these tax types is essential. And state policymakers should be cautious when relying on revenue derived from shrinking tax bases, where collections are known to be volatile, or where we don't yet have data to forecast revenues reliably. So that concludes my presentation. I will turn things over to Catherine and open it up for Q&A.
Thanks, everyone. Now we are ready to take your questions. You can submit a question at any time by clicking on the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And once you do so, enter your query in the questions box. We ask that you please begin with your name and your state. Here's one to start off with, Mary. How big of an overall budget impact are we talking about when we talk about sin taxes?
That is a great question, and it is important to keep in mind that overall, as a share of state budgets, these sin tax sources are relatively small. Looking across the U.S., they make up about 2.3% of total state revenues. That's a 2015 figure. But there is, of course, also substantial variation when we look across all 50 states. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Nevada, sin taxes represent the largest share of total revenues in the state of Nevada at about 12%. And North Dakota is the state where sin taxes are the smallest share of total revenues at about 1%. So these are relatively small shares of state budgets, but they are still important, particularly as we see state policymakers sometimes turning to these sources as potential budget fixes.
Great, thanks, Mary. Here's another one. You mentioned before that it really matters the way a sin tax is structured. Could you expound on that a bit?
Sure, and the distinction that we're making here is between taxing on the quantity of a product versus taxing on the price of a product. And because some of the sin tax sources that we're talking about today are taxed on quantity, and therefore increases in revenue rely on increased consumption or tax rate hikes, absent either of those two events, states will not see increases in the revenue collected. So where we're seeing states experiment with some ad valorem structures or taxes on the value of a product, for example, some states are taxing the legalized marijuana in this way, we will expect the trends to behave differently just because the tax is associated with the price of the good and not just the quantity of the good. And it's just important to keep those tax structure dynamics in mind as we're trying to understand why we're seeing differences in certain trends and what may be driving them.
Great, thanks, Mary. And is there a most appropriate way to use these particular forms of revenue? Are there states that have done it really well that you could talk about?
That's another great question. And the takeaway here when it comes to think about budgeting these revenues is that states really just need to be aware of how these revenue sources are likely to perform, or where forecasting that performance is a challenge because of a lack of historical data, to just be cautious about how those revenues are committed, especially in early years. And Larson touched on this a little bit in his discussion of Colorado. So one particular example I might point to also on the point of how marijuana tax revenues are budgeted is that the state of Nevada passed legislation just in 2017 to direct some of their new recreational marijuana tax revenue into the state's rainy day fund, acknowledging that there may be some challenges in forecasting that revenue, so ensuring that some of it would be set aside to guard against shortfalls in the future.
Thanks, Mary. And speaking of marijuana revenues, how are states making marijuana revenue forecasts given the lack of historical data to this point?
This is certainly a challenge, and any time that you are taxing a new market, particularly for an activity that was previously illegal and has now been made legal and regulated and taxed, trying to estimate the size of the base is a challenge. And in the case of marijuana, and this also applies to sports betting, for states to try to anticipate how newly legal activities might interact with ongoing black market activities is also a significant aspect of the forecast challenge. So, so far states are doing their best, and particularly for states that are adopting later, being able to look to the experiences of, for example, Colorado and Washington and try to use those experiences to inform their own estimates has been the approach that we've seen so far.
Yeah, and I'd like to weigh in on that, because when we were producing our estimates in 2013, there was no other states. We didn't know what the market would look like, and so what we ended up doing is we took the federal tax data on marijuana use, or not tax data, federal data on marijuana use, and applied that to our population and said, okay, about 12% of Colorado residents are marijuana users, and then made some assumptions about how much they would use. So there's some studies out there estimating how much use the average user uses. So we had, quantities, a total quantity that we expect to be consumed as sort of the market of marijuana users. And then we used our medical marijuana market to try to estimate the cost. And we sort of put that all together and came up with some estimates, and we estimated that the state would collect $67 million in new marijuana tax revenue in the first full fiscal year. And that's the key figure that we're looking at for Tabor and for voter information purposes. And in the first full year, we actually collected $66.1 million. So we were high on some estimates and low on others, but overall it worked out pretty well. So I think that there is some data out there, even if you don't want to rely on another state to base your revenue estimates off of.
Thanks, Larson. And while you're on the topic, we had a question come in asking about local taxes as it pertains to legalized recreational marijuana. Do local governments also tax this legalized recreational marijuana?
Yes, in Colorado, so home rule cities, they have the authority to tax whatever they want, whenever they want. And for example, Denver, I think, has a 7.25% special sales tax on marijuana. and that's at the retail level. Some counties have an excise tax, so they may not want to have recreational sales, but under the Constitution allowing them to legalize the possession of marijuana, they gave them local control to legalize sales. But they don't want to deal with a marijuana storefront, but some counties have authorized marijuana grow facilities. And in those counties, they've authorized an excise tax. So the Constitution does give local governments quite a bit of control on how they regulate it, whether they allow sales or grows at all. And then also, if they allow sales and grows, how to tax it. And I don't know what the highest rate is, but it's usually between 2.5% and 10%, just sort of depending on what the local government approved. And all those are voter approved under Tabor as well.
Thanks, Larson. And one more related question for you while we have you. Is there much of a substitution effect that you see among sin taxes? For example, could states adopting legalized marijuana see decreased alcohol revenue?
We talked about that, and I think it's a potential. But every time we've looked at it, I guess in Colorado we haven't seen a reduction in the alcohol excise taxes. So for beer, wine, spirits, anything like that. And one thing that we keep coming back to is marijuana is available. It's available in every state, every town. And so the marijuana users are likely already using marijuana. And so the substitution effect between marijuana and alcohol has already occurred. And so your current excise tax revenues on beer and alcohol and wine already has a component in there of you have some people who are choosing to use marijuana as opposed to alcohol. And so that's certainly been our experience. It's hard to know exactly what's changed or if anything has changed in that process.
Thanks, Larson. We had another question come in about indirect revenue gains from legalizing marijuana. Colorado's tax structure for marijuana constitutes 1.5% of all taxes collected, and the direct fiscal impact, I think you mentioned, is about $170 million, though you should please correct me if I'm mistaken. Is Colorado aware of much indirect revenue gains coming from marijuana legalization?
So the direct revenue impact is $211 million. We don't have a good way to measure the indirect impact. There's certainly some people who used to be in the black market for marijuana who are now in the regulated market and are paying use tax. Well, the sales and use taxes is the direct impact, but you're going to have some workers in the marijuana industry who are paying payroll taxes and income taxes that they may not have been before. One of the other impacts that we've had in marijuana has been a significant increase in the value of warehouse property in Denver and other areas of the state that have legalized marijuana grows. And so that ends up boosting property tax revenue to local governments and reduces the amount of money needed for the state backfill. One of the real challenges is knowing how much marijuana has actually impacted our economy. So Colorado is doing great. It's got a lot of people moving into the state. Home price appreciation is crazy, and just a really, really strong economy. And that is occurring at the same time that we legalize marijuana. And so trying to figure out, marijuana isn't a big enough industry to be driving that growth. It's definitely contributing to it, but it's not enough sales relative to all the other retail sales that are occurring in the state to really be driving it. And so that's one of the challenges, is knowing exactly how much is from the marijuana industry and legalization versus just we have a strong economy and income taxes and corporate income taxes and sales taxes are increasing because we have more people in the state and businesses are more profitable and that sort of stuff.
Great, thank you so much, Larson. Here's a question. How does the recent Supreme Court ruling on sports betting play into this research? Can we expect to see new taxes from states on sports betting? And how should states be approaching this new opportunity?
It's definitely a very relevant and much discussed question of the moment, and I think I mentioned that many states are considering sports betting, and in many cases, states are already estimating the revenue that they expect to collect from sports betting. Somewhat similar to this discussion we're having about marijuana, trying to forecast the base for sports betting, where you're moving previously black market activity into the legal regulated market, it's simply a challenge to forecast that base, although there are numbers out there. And the other dynamic that is we just don't have data to know yet is whether we can expect sports betting to behave like other types of gambling, where states that legalize, and particularly states that legalize early, may see significant revenue windfalls, but then see that revenue decline as other states enter the market and compete with existing businesses. So if sports betting does behave like traditional gambling, then I think that's a pattern we can expect to see, but that data just isn't available yet, and time will tell. But it's worth noting that of the states that have revenue estimates out there, in many cases they have pretty wide ranges in terms of the revenue that they're hoping to collect in the first year.
Great, thank you so much, Mary. And at this point, we are going to wrap up our webinar. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Please note that both the syntax report and the report on non-recurring revenue can be found on Pew's website. That's pewtrusts.org/fiscal-health. And if you have any additional questions or we were unable to get to your question during this webinar, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I'm happy to direct you to Mary or Emily or Larson for further information. Thank you everyone so much, and have a great rest of your day.